Dr. J. Drew Lanham is a native of Edgefield, South Carolina, and the product of a family farm, abundant wildness, and the bittersweet legacy of land interdependence by chain and choice. He is an alumni distinguished professor, provost professor, and master teacher of wildlife ecology at Clemson University. Dr. Lanham is a cultural and conservation ornithologist whose work addresses the confluence of race, place, and nature. He is the poet laureate of his home county and the author of Sparrow Envy, a field guide to bird and lesser beasts, as well as The Home Place, memoirs of a colored man's love affair with nature. Drew's creative work and opinion appears in Orion Magazine, Vanity Fair, The Oxford American, The Bitter Southerner, Newsweek, Slate, and many other sources, as well as several podcasts. He is known widely as a conservation and environmental advocate and has served on national boards, including the National Audubon Society, the Aldo Leopold Foundation, BirdNote, and the American Birding Association. The South Carolina Land Conservancy Upstate Forever recognized him as a land conservation champion, citing his decades of teaching, research, and writing that have made the field of conservation more accessible and inclusive. Drew is currently a contributing editor for Orion Magazine, a wide-ranging public speaker, a lifelong bird watcher and adorer, and a hunter conservationist who writes on the eco-psycho-social edges where the richness of wildness and identity converge. Drew resides in Seneca, South Carolina, a soaring, broad-winged hawk's downhill glide from the foot of the Southern Appalachian Escarpment that the Cherokee once called the Blue Wall.
Thank you, Carson. Thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. Dr. Smart has told me that I have 2.5 hours. Not really. It's a kind of a cruel joke, right? It's a pleasure to be here this evening. I see many friends, students whom I advised and whom I have long-standing relationships with, colleagues, peers, who've come. Most of you I don't know, but what I would like to do tonight, if I may, Lane, is I'm going to take a little bit from a ceremonial sort of take. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. And we're used to hearing that normally when what's happening? A wedding. We're at a land-grant university where we are supposed to be wed to land and to that concept of nurture, which we would expect in any relationship in which we engage. So tonight you'll see slides rolling behind me. There'll be blue things in there. All right. But then I want to share some of my words, but then also to share the words of others, because I think part of what we engage in at university in this seminary of higher learning, have you heard that somewhere before? Right? That's in who we are, that we are to be exposed to alternatives, to different ways of thinking. So I hope tonight, by the end of the night, that really I've not answered as many questions as I've raised. Because ultimately, it's not about the answers to many of these issues, but how we respond to the questions that are raised. And then we can spend our lifetimes and our careers answering questions. Because I tell you, the homework does not end. All right? So we'll proceed. I want to first share a piece that, and I'll see those of you who have done this homework. I did assign this. You did do the readings, right? Sublime silence surrounds me. I have walked to the top of the hill, plopped myself down to watch the world around me. I have no fear here in the world of trees, weeds, and growing things. This is the world I was born into, a world of wild things. In it, the wilderness in me speaks. I am wild. I hear my elders caution Mama, telling her that she is making a mistake letting me run wild. Letting me run with my brother as though no gender separates us. We are making our childhood together in the Kentucky hills, experiencing the freedom that comes from living away from civilization. Even as a child, I knew that to be raised in the country, to come from the backwoods, left one without meaning or presence. Growing up, we did not use terms like hillbilly. Country folk lived on isolated farms away from the city. Backwoods folks lived in remote areas, in the hills and hollers. To be from the backwoods was to be part of the wild. Where we lived, Black folks were as much a part of the wild, living in a natural way on the earth as white folk. All backwood folks were poor by material standards. They knew how to make do. They were not wanting to tame the wildness in themselves or nature. Living in the Kentucky hills was where I first learned the importance of being wild. The author? Somebody? Bell Hooks. The late Bell Hooks from West Virginia. Heard of her? Probably not. A few of you have. Todd, Dr. Petty. I mean, how powerful is that? You know, if I'd started with, there are some who can live with wild things and some who cannot, you would have come back with who? Aldo, right? The point is here, this perspective from this extraordinary Black woman of the Southern Appalachians. Yeah, they are Black folk in them hills. I count myself one of them. So I want to share these words like Bell's, like Aldo's, something borrowed here, but then words of my own, and I hope that they inspire you again to think about why you are here. How many wildlife majors do I have here? Forestry and ag? How many land grant majors do I have? All of you better raise your hand. Seriously. Seriously. If you're at this university, this is called a cow college. The halls of this very building, these weird halls were made so they could run cows down them. You know that? Newman is the slaughterhouse. Well, they stopped that because some of y'all got upset because they would slaughter on Tuesday mornings. But then you would go and eat a burger at lunch. Yes, I've got the green light. I'll let you. I'm just used to talking to people in little squares. So this is wonderful. It's nice to have real issues other than the ones that, you know. I'll just send you the link again, and then you can all read. Hey, Colby. All right, thank you.
It's
It sounded-
right now.
Is that better? Okay, so now I got to tone it down, right? Okay, so with that idea of perspective, right, that that hearing from this person, this Black woman, Bell Hooks just died a few months ago. But this whole idea of wildness, which we are beginning to challenge in many ways, which we have to challenge, right? I mean, we think about wild, the very definition of wilderness includes what? Lack of access. Whoa. I'm gonna protect a place that everybody can't get to. That's democratic. But then I enjoy those places as much as anyone. What about that vista where you want to post that picture to Instagram or wherever, and you want that sunset with only the rise and run of hills and slopes and peaks and the silhouettes of trees and the sun setting just so, but there's that damn 5G tower over there that's serving Navajo children who did not have access to 5G or telehealth. But your skyline, your IG skyline just got interrupted. Those are issues, right? Those are issues that you are going to have to think about, whether you are an engineer, whether you're a forester, whether you're a wildlife biologist, a fisheries biologist, you're going to have to consider these issues. Is it offensive to talk about getting rid of immigrants? What about invasive exotics? How many of you want to get rid of invasive exotics? All right, then I want you to head to South Dakota and tell them to get rid of those pheasants. True. Why do we accept some things and not others? So it's a matter of perspective, and ethics drive our perspective. All right, we can talk about ethics as being sort of the rules that we live by. We can talk about ethics as sort of our code. You know, you have an honor code that you're not going to look this way and that way at somebody else's test. You have an honor code that you're going to dutifully apply yourself to every last penny of those tuition dollars. I would offer that if you leave with nothing else from university, that you leave with some better sense of code and how that code can change. And that code changes in many ways through thought. So I'm going to share this, this piece that I wrote called Thinking, since we're talking about thought. And it's a funny thing, because how many of you think about how you think? Good, good. How many have changed how you think since you've been here? Not in this class, but good, right? If there was a metric at one time that was discouraging to me, because it said that Clemson students essentially remained flat in that process from freshman to graduation. That was discouraging. That means that, you know, I know that we always rank as the happiest students, but sometimes y'all ought to get doggone ticked off at some things, because there are things in the world to get ticked off about. You ought to be joyful about things, to tears sometimes, things that you never thought would bring you to that place. There ought to be some sense of enrichment that takes you beyond what you thought to what you think to what you might think. And those possibilities are great. It's what a seminary of higher learning, I think, is all about. George Washington Carver said, "Nothing is more beautiful than the loveliness of the woods before sunrise." Who knows who George Washington Carver was? What's he most famous for? Peanuts. See, took the man and reduced him to a legume. So many patents, did so much, essentially saved the soil of the South. Did y'all know that George Washington Carver lectured at Clemson University in 1922, 23? Couldn't stay here, but lectured in Tillman Hall, I believe, to a full auditorium. The only way that we know about Carver's presence really is the widow of a cadet who Carver kept up correspondence with. She donated his letters that were amazing. She donated those letters back to the university. And it reveals a relationship that in many ways transcends the identity that separated people at that time. So there was at least one person who was thinking differently at Clemson University back then. But George Washington Carver came here. He made a tour of land grant colleges, many colleges, and talked about things like plowing on the contour, like planting cover crops. Rick, he was planting food plots back then, right? So when you think about Carver, there's a connection here. And more than peanuts, but certainly a part of our land grant. I think about land a lot. In fact, I am possessed by it. I think about the lay of the land, how it came to be, what natural forces have changed it, what human forces have mangled it, how concrete and asphalt doom it. I think about the promise that land holds for the future and what history it preserves from our past. I think about how land rises and runs, lifts and falls. I think about hills and hollers. I think about great rifts. I think about grand canyons. I think about mountains and monadnocks. I think about swamps and sandhills. I think about draws. I think about drains. I think about the rivers running through the land, the animals burrowing under the land, and the birds flying over the land. I think about the sounds that come from the land, the whining of katydids and crickets on steamy summer nights, the incessant serenading of red-eyed vireos on newborn spring days, and the chattering of squirrels hiding acorns on chill, crisp autumn mornings. I think about the clapper rails applauding at the edge of a salt march stage and the teletyping dictations of pine woods tree frogs in a rain-soaked longleaf pine savanna. I think about the solace of winter whispered on a northwest breeze and the mournful groaning of the bare-boned trees. I think about the soil underneath the land, its shifting sandiness, rough rockiness, its rich loaminess and sticky clayiness. I think about the perfume of place, the pleasant mustiness of decaying leaves on a Blue Ridge forest floor, the sulfur stink of a Beaufort mudflat at low tide stinking so good, the drunken sweetness of an orchard in October. I think about mountains. Now, I've been moved to tears by the stark beauty of snow-capped peaks touching heaven. Those western mountains are young, brash spires, bragging and daring us to confront the impossibility of their being. But in our native South Carolina, the mountains are humble things. They're less boastful, worn down by the pressures of time and weather. I see their rounded shoulders as a testament to persistence and the inevitability of change, which wears granite and gneiss and quartz to sand and soil and silt. A two-lane highway, once an American Indian path that winds like a black snake through an upstate valley called Illinois, lets the lazy wander from afar. The stone bare faces of Table Rock and Caesar's Head are enough for those in a hurry. The road leads to places with interesting names: Sunset, Pumpkin Town, Tigerville, quaint in the ways you'd expect. There are things to buy and maybe things to see in those places, but I think too much about what lies beyond these simple snares. I see the blue wall and want to push past comfort. And so I go into the mountains from time to time, invading their dim coves and caverns. I cannot see the pinnacles in these places. I cannot worship the horizons they make, where poplar, basswood, hemlock, and rhododendron filter the light to almost constant dusk. I am consumed, swallowed whole in awe. I settle into places with old names like Jocassee, Kiowee, Eastatoe, the horse pasture, the muster ground. I think about what used to be there, flocks of green and gold Carolina parakeets roosting in the cavernous hollows of monstrous yellow poplars, cool creeks running unimpeded by what we call progress, no lakeshore real estate or exclusive gated communities with names made up to sound wild. In the spring, the newness of things up on the ridge of the edge of the Blue Ridge still overwhelms. Rebirth and renewal are cliches, but speak truths anyway. Come summer, I am devoured by remnant forests that from far away look uniformly verdant, but from within are every shade of green imaginable. In autumn, death and departing are everywhere as canopies fall to the ground in pieces and birds look further south. Winter's starkness, a drab gray and brown outlined against the suddenly there sky like pen and ink on rag-made paper, lead me into a melancholy and sense of being that's deeply rooted. In the belly of a blue wall forest, every season howls through the hollers and rolls over the hills with a clarity that cries out for worship. I know then that I am in the depths of a living, breathing thing, become a part of that living, breathing thing. I leave the mountains and find the land at the foot of the blue wall. I think about the Piedmont as I roller coaster up and down through it, rolling, undulating ridge and valley, hill and slope. Things are in pieces here, fragments of what used to be. A bit of forest, a piece of field, a wetland rarely, all surrounded by a sea of cement. Acres and acres of asphalt. Even where we find forests, the trees are often planted like row crops. Elsewhere, the loblolly pines have crept like weeds over the landscape. Invaders planted out of desperation and now gone wild, they held some of the soil on the old fields so that it didn't all wash away to the sea. In most places, the thin crust of topsoil that remains struggles to hide the gummy clay underneath. And when the infrequent rains do come, the Midlands weep erosively. I think about the oak and hickory that used to be here. I think about the squirrels and blue jays that spread the seeds of the forest, and the white-tailed deer and wild turkeys that are thankful for an acorn bounty. In spring, I think about the vireos and warblers and the gobblers that give me, but not Rick Willie, the slip on April mornings. In fall, I imagine big bucks rubbing cedars on the dim edge of dawn and hermit thrushes settling into the same thickets at eventide. There are Edens to be found even in Piedmont paradises lost. As things roll up and down, they will eventually flatten. Ancient dunes, sand and pine and scrub oak creep in. On the sand hills and in the flat woods below them, I think about gopher tortoises that patiently share their burrows with others, while Bachman's sparrows sing sweetly in the colonnades of old growth longleaf. Maybe some of those big trees are rendering sap like candles, or perhaps they are pockmarked with perfect holes, holding the next generation of red cockaded woodpeckers. The once expansive swaths of longleaf and wiregrass woodland are mostly gone, cut down, covered over, converted. Neither gopher tortoises nor Bachman sparrows nor red-cockaded woodpeckers find safe haven in concrete or condominiums. I think about the tragedy in all of this loss and wonder how much of it we'll be able to salvage. I think about the land as I speed by it on busy interstates, driving at hyperspeed on 4-lane highways to someplace better leaves very little time for looking beyond a blurry wall of trees. Headed downhill from upcountry to low, the land falls away from the road at the mercy of water, of creek, of river, of swamp, of marsh, and ultimately of the sea. Here and there, I glimpse the trees that tell me where the water stands. Cypress, sycamore, and willow love the wet places. Sand slowly gives way to silt. Things bottom out the further south I go, and in the lowest places, the water will sit if not drained, diverted, or dammed. The very highway I fly onto to get somewhere unimportant really fast is often the dike itself, separating one part of the world from the other. It has also become murderer's row for many things. But in spite of the engineering, the water flows sluggishly. And even when it appears to stagnate, it cooks the wondrous stew of living things. Whirligig beetles dancing on the tea-stained surface, nervous mosquito fish darting away from the shadows where bowfin lurk. As I drive by, the gaps in the green wall reveal feathered statues, egrets and herons, maybe a wood stork or two. I imagine alligators cruising in the depths, snapping turtles lying in the wait. Remembering, dreaming, contemplating, even commiserating, land is somehow always on my mind. I think this is because I'm missing the land from which I came. The pastures, fields, the woods, creeks, and bottoms of my home place. My obsession is born of the land in Edgefield that nurtured me, land in the middle of nowhere that meant everything to me. It is born of growing up on garden-raised vegetables, pasture-fed beef, and the sweet fruits of our own orchards. It is born of some of the best years of my life. My missing is born of my ancestors' sweat equity, ancestors who toiled on the land as enslaved Africans, eventually owned some of it, and then gave away many of its riches for pennies on the dollar. It is born of my frustration with fragmented farms and the families whose lives would be more whole if their land was whole too. But then again, maybe I think too much about Black folks denying their kinship to country too. Not Mother Africa, but our country here. Back roads, dirt road, deeply dark, pinpricked with stars at night. Who even gives a damn if you piss in your own backyard? Hair-raising hoot owl country. I don't expect everyone to feel the same way that I do about land. For many of us, the scars are still too fresh. Fields of cotton stretching to the horizon, land worked, sweated, and suffered over for the profit of others probably won't engender warm feelings among Black people. But the land, in spite of its history, still holds hope for making good on the promises we thought it could, especially if we can reconnect to it. My reparations lie not in what someone will give me, but what I already own. This land can grow crops for us as well as it does for others. It can yield loblolly pine and white oak for us as it has for others. And it can nurture wildlife in the spirit for us just like it has for others. Place and land and nature. How we tie these things together is critical to our sense of self-purpose and our fit in the world. These things are our trinity. This is true for people everywhere, but especially for those of us in the South. If you will, follow the ribbon of Interstate 95 that stretches from the southernmost tip of South Carolina and parallels the coast to the North Carolina line. Beyond the beauty of moss-draped bald cypress wetlands and deep dark pine forests below the slow beating wings of angel white egrets and an invisible God, thousands of people can't afford a square foot of the soil that their ancestors paid for with their very lives. These people sit tantalizingly close to wealth many of their kindred owned before it was taken away or lost. St. Helena Island near Hilton Head stands largely alone as an exception, with much of the land still in Black hands and the African culture of its Gullah residents nationally treasured. That's changed. Beaufort's one of the most rapidly gentrifying counties anywhere. For too many, third world poverty is the shameful inheritance shared along this corridor, a corridor called shameful. Barely potable water, substandard health care and schools, and land languishing and mismanagement define everyday life here. The government subsidies that pay people to grow trees, protect wetlands, or manage wildlife tend to bypass most of the Black landowners. As wealth whizzes by in a German luxury sedan at 90 miles an hour, many see any hope speeding by too. I've been fortunate to be in many parts of the world, but my wanderlust seems to always find its way home to this Piedmont clay, to loblolly pine, to prairie warblers. And though I can't be at my home place, I have been lucky. I do have land and I think about it. I think about quail calling in the pines that I just had thinned. I think about hunting those turkeys in the alleys between the cutover and the creek bottom. I think about the comfort of eating food that comes by my own hand and hard work and luck. I imagine the 40 acres and the swayback mules so many were promised but never got, and need to make best on what I have. And so I think about land, but more and more I also think about how other Black and brown folks think about land. I wonder how our lives would change for the better if the ties to place weren't broken by bad memories, misinformation, ignorance, and policy that becomes malfeasance. I think about school children playing in safe, clean, green spaces where the water and air flow clear and the bird song sounds sweet. More and more, I think of land not just in remote, desolate wilderness, but in inner city parks and suburban backyards. I think about land in community gardens. I think of land and all that it brings to my life. I think of land and hope that you are thinking of land too. So, I don't know how many times I use the word think, but it's clear that it's sort of an obsession. And here at Clemson University, it ought be our obsession. We ought be wedded to it. And I would say that if we aren't, then we're in breach of a contract. Now, those of us on this side of the street who've had classes in P&A, who actually know where Newman Hall is, those of us who passed the test of getting around in Lahotsky, I hope that there is some understanding of our responsibility, that ethical responsibility to steward not just land, but one another in relationship. In relationship. That's how I think about land, in relationship, and not just deed and title that cause me to own land and want to put up no trespass signs, but land that comes to own me. You ever been on a piece of land and you felt like the land grabbed you as much as you grabbed the land? That's an important thing. It's important in whatever land you think belongs to you. Take this one simple test. Take shoes off and walk on it. And feel that soil. If there's a relationship to be had, that land will tell you. So thinking of land, I turn to the people who have thought about land. So maybe a little more. So we dealt with something borrowed. What kind of bird is that? Yellow warble. I think about land. How have others thought about land? And this morning, I guess it's what some would call the witching hour. It was a little later than that, but a couple of lines came to mind, and so I wanted to share this, and I had no other title than to call this his, but hers and theirs too. Aldo Leopold said, I have purposely, this is the epigraph, I have purposely presented the land ethic as a product of social evolution because nothing so important as an ethic is ever written. It evolves in the minds of a thinking community. Aldo thought like a mountain, but it was a pre-climate warming glacial move. His musings, post-predator massacre in a New Mexico draw, where the she-wolf's fierce green fire died for what he believed would be more deer, inspired him over the course of decades to land think beyond his present human want. I do dig that, coming as it did from an imperfect human being whom I know had faults, but I believe in my heart curable ones, not enslaving or fondling skulls, or proposing that others be left out. We come to know he was not the only one, though, to ponder what doing the right thing meant. Sister Bell considered summits too, rounded off shoulders of old eastern slopes, ridges studded with pine, coves cloaked in hemlock and rhododendron. Her Appalachian vision ignited in verse, howled with soul over hogbacks, a Black woman being fully engaged in what it meant to be us in different ways. Appreciation begins with the pretty, Leopold said, looking out on the Wisconsin River to vernal hues in an April spring. There was a time when the river running through it meant more than double hauls, more than split bamboo rods and creels filled with gills. Harriet Tubman sang souls to freedom on the Combie's dark, slow molasses flow, almost 1,000 liberated to humanity from sucking rice field pluff. They waded in the water like the old hymn said. I am grateful for the beauty of her courage to command that raid, to call by barred owls who whoop, 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 to blaze trails through wilderness, following a star-filled drinking gourd. Muir claimed the mountains called to him. He spoke in prayerful reverence to trees that he did not want to share with those who did not share his whiteness. But Sacagawea listened to them first. And she of the Shoshone with York, the enslaved explorer, saved Lewis and Clark's western wandering aspects from abject failure. But few even know their names. Red woman, black man, color making them some afterthought, whitewashing becomes the policy, a critical fact of race, not theory. Audubon killed birds to paint them, didn't give that or enslaving people second thought. Dear sweet Rachel Carson loved the feathered ones with words to save them from poisoning death, thought about better for all, even as she succumbed to the sins she fought. Go west, young man, go west. I thought as a boy, that was my test until they told me all the cowboys looked like John Wayne and now Kevin Costner. Until I saw Bill Pickett's face. Understood Stagecoach Mary's tall Montana bravery, came to know that 1 in 4 on many trails were Negroes. George Washington Carver opined on being in the woods before sunrise. You see, TR really didn't have a monopoly on wildness. Old Pitchfork Ben couldn't see his way past hate of an entire race to let equality through Clemson's college gates, though built on the backs of those bondaged by chattel slavery to work for nothing, imprisoned to lay ivory tower bricks for stealing a toy. They weren't good enough, human enough to merit land grant learning here. Send them elsewhere. Give them half of the 3/5 the founding fathers said they were worth. You do that math. Old Strom fought hard to keep that unholy oath separate and unequal, his policy for progress. And so I take pride each day as a son of these red hills where the Blue Ridge yawns its greatness, to have those who would deny, those who would destroy and demean, toss and turn in their very graves. To have what has always been his become also hers and theirs. To have white expand to black and brown and red and every hue in between, for green to grow. Our land grant mission now to open the path for knowledge for all who will come, for all who will exchange time learning, for all who will love. So I think the key is for me in thinking about ethic, and I talk a lot about this introspection. I talk a lot about thinking and how thinking changes. And what it means now to be a steward of the land, what it means to be connected to land, what it means to be wed to land, what it means to commit to this land grant mission, the ethic that's required for us to be somehow efficient in all of that. What's required of us ultimately is this deep, abiding, intense care. Because guess what? If you're in a major, for the most part, that has you sitting in this hall, you're not going to become rich. So there's something called out counseling, where if you think this is where you make your millions, this ain't it. It's not, I can just tell you. But it is where you will make a million memories that others will never have. It is where you will get to put your feet in soil that others just hear about. It's where you get paid in sunrises and sunsets, and that's compounded interest with bird song and frog calls. Maybe being on the stand in the right place at the right time, and you get to feed your soul and you never even step in Whole Foods, but you're awash in it. So the ethic that's required, 2 words, 4 letters, care, C-A-R-E, and love, L-O-V-E. Neither one of them fits in Wordle. But they are the essential solutions for us. So whatever the code is, right? And there should be as many codes as people in this room, because we all have these individual experiences. We all have these prisms through which we see the world. And as we see the world through these prisms that bend our light, right? That ultimately we become part of this spectrum. It's more than Roy G. Biv. It's this amazing thing that you will realize as you come through this place, and years from now, you have the opportunity to think about how you thought, how you think, and how you look forward to those thoughts changing. So I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the opportunity that Kirby gave me to come in and to speak to you. It's a great honor anytime you get to speak to home folks. And it's a great honor to be, I cannot tell you how many times I've looked up at faces in this hall, right? I started teaching conservation biology here way back a while ago. But part of the reason that I am here now is that I would come in this room and I was just, it was just always bad news, right? It was just always bad news. And there's a lot of bad news out there. And that bad news in some ways is job security for us, but it's also a dreary task, and it feels Sisyphean, like you're rolling this huge boulder uphill and it's constantly trying to come back on you. But you can't get weary in this work. You can get tired, but you can't be weary in it. So the ethic requires sort of this constant effort, just like these migratory birds that are flying over the Gulf. A warbler can't stop beating its wings and soar. We can't stop beating our wings. That's part of our ethic. This care and this love are what's going to carry us. So seeing you here now, and after all these years, seeing those faces of drear and dread, and saying, you know what, we got to find another way to get the data to people, not only that science that's critical for us to know and understand and to learn how to do, but how do we take words and use those words to move us forward in some way beyond the dreary seats in which we sit? How do we go out into the real world when all seems stacked against us? When somebody says, I need you to work from here to here, oh no, there's no overtime for that actually. And you say, oh yeah, but I do get to see this. My office does not have these walls. So again, thank you, Kirby. Thank you for being here. And I think maybe we have time for some questions.
Yes, please ask your questions. If you would, for the sake of the audience, repeat the question before.
Sure, sure will.
So who'd like to start with a question, please?
No questions, Kate? It's my assistant, Kate. There.
I have one that is fascinating anytime I've seen you with your pictures. How do you get so close to wildlife to capture the images that you often do?
Well, there is this first, thank you, Kirby. I'm not a real photographer, so I'm not, metering and all that stuff. I have a point and shoot. And I get as close as I can. A lot of it's zoom and it's mechanical, Kirby, but sitting still, you'll hear me now. You've heard of birding. I call myself more bird watcher. And really COVID impacted a part of that, because as we were restricted to our backyards, I wasn't traveling all over the place. You have to sit and wait for things to come to you. And part of that I learned as a hunter, right? I have a great friend, Rick Willie here, and Rick would Rick would say, you know, I was on the today and I saw something, right? And he wasn't talking about some huge buck. You know, he would talk about something else, that the patience of being in a place and letting nature come to you and being there. So that's a lot of it. You know, I call my pickup truck my Jones Road office. Dr. Andre knows where I camp out. I'm telling people now where to find me, which is a bad thing. So Todd, I'm on Jones Road a lot of times over there at the, hopefully a grassland that we work on at some point. But to let wildlife come to you, you know, what happens, and the sun, what some people call the Bushmen, there's a book that's been written, it's called What the Robin Knows. I'm trying to remember the author, some of you may remember it, but there's if you notice, you know, when you go into a place, you push something ahead of you. If you go with a great deal of anticipation and all angst up, have you ever, I mean, your companion animals know. How many of you have noticed the change in the behavior of your companion animal, your dog or your cat or whatever, when you're all amped up and angsty? And they'll either come close or like, oh no, okay, you know, I don't want to deal with you right now. Well, you push that out. I mean, it's like, you know, Rick, it's like going into the woods, you know, slung with your gun and this anticipation and, oh, I'm going to do so-and-so today. And you never see anything. And then you go in the very same place, the very same way, except you're not carrying that gun and your anticipation is different and you see things. So you push energy in front of you. You push, I mean, first of all, it's palpable to other things. So I try to learn how to go out in different ways. And again, sitting during the pandemic in the same place, you know, waiting on the next Zoom call, it was amazing how birds I just sort of fit in. I wasn't chasing them with the binoculars. And imagine, how many of you have ever had somebody looking at you with binoculars? It's a little creepy, isn't it? Right? It's creepy. So those predator eyes that are out there, I tell people sometimes to see more, you have to take your binoculars down. And I mean that not just from the physical sense of what you can see, but what you can see. So if you take your binoculars down, as you're looking at, you know, I don't know, black ducks or black-necked stilts on that low country marsh, you take your binoculars down and sit for just a minute and think about that place. You can probably see all the way back to, like, I don't know, 1740. Because that place didn't just get there. And if you take your binoculars down again, you can probably see back to when that rice marsh was Cypress Tupelo swamp. And if you listen with your binoculars down, you may be able to hear those Carolina parakeets or the double rap knocks of ivory-billed woodpeckers. So perspective. Sometimes it requires us to slow down, and that's how some of those pictures come into play. But I'll tell you, Kirby, recently, more of what I do is, mostly I take my cell phone out. And the thing that changed with me is as much as I love macro photography, I really love the whole idea of just the scene and having people imagine what was there. So that creates a sort of different thing. That's sort of the longer answer that you got, but yeah, Greg, Dr. Yarrow.
I'm teaching the course you used to take wildlife conservation policy. One of the students asked for a question that I want to ask you. If you could go back right now and ask young brunette in Edgefield County, your younger self, what advice would you give your younger self
Wow.
now?
Linger longer between the ramshackle and the ranch, between my grandmother's house and my parents' house. Linger longer outside between expectation and demand. you know, get in trouble more for being outside. I was down there 2 weeks ago in my grandmother's yard collecting bulbs from daffodils and snowdrops that she probably planted back 1920, and everything, what happens, y'all have heard about like the COVID-19, right? I'm talking about the COVID-19 pounds that you put on, right? I put on more than that. And so, as you get older, like clothes, it's all that. But I went back down there and everything had shrank. The pecan tree that I used to climb, it didn't seem so big anymore. The distance from her house that's fallen in on itself to my parents' old house that's been grown up now in lob and sweet gum, growing up literally through that house. It seems now that I could almost throw a rock from her house to that house. But back then it was like forever. And so if I could go back, I would linger. I would climb more trees. I would poke sticks in more holes. I would have taken the long route home. Thanks for asking that. Yes, and then Colby.
What advice would you have for those of us who work with students and undergrads in particular? How do we help them?
How do we help to keep the drive to keep going? Again, the incident in this room that happened to me was, I was on the way from non-game. I was still teaching non-game that had no lab. So we were taught, we were teaching that class. I was teaching that class and I was on the way. And this was this 2001? I got to remember the year. But anyway, I'm coming down the hall and a former grad student who's now a professor at Augusta University, Brand Cromer, he met me in the hall and he said, Doc, they found it. I said, what are you talking about? And I was in a hurry, had that big, thick Meth and Carol book under my arm, trying to figure out what am I going to lecture about today? I said, found what, Brand? And he said, they found an ivory bill. And it floored me. I mean, literally, I'm just standing there and I go back into my office, and to tell you can probably date it by this. It was Netscape 2.0. So I go back to Netscape and I pull it up, and here it is in the White River in Arkansas, the rediscovery of the ivory billed woodpecker. And I came in here and I cried in front of the class because it was the first news that I felt like I had given them, that there was hope in this bird. Now, this bird was just redeclared extinct. So I tell that story not for it to be a story of woe and its persistence, but really of whoa, slow down, right? Slow down and think about the beauty that we have now. And so part of the motivation is not just to fix what's broken, but to enjoy what's not. And you find some joy in that. And if you ask people why they're doing this work, and I think it's important, we need to ask why are y'all doing this? I mean, we got peers sometimes to be like, why are you doing this? And if you go back and sort of to Greg's question, I think about, the commas that gave me pause. And the commas that first gave me pause were tadpoles in a puddle. All those little commas there. And the scientist in me saw them, counted, even thought about, well, how many more will there be? I certainly had to think about sexual reproduction at that point because they just didn't magically appear like I thought they had. And that wonder, I think is part of what helps us hold on to students. But if we're just constantly beating the drum of all this bad in the world, who wants to work in that? So we work to restore beauty sometimes, but sometimes we work to hold on to what we have. And so getting them to tell those stories so that they're invested in it, so that others know why you're here, You know, I ask writers all the time, other writers, I say, well, who's your audience? Who are you writing to? And it amazes me how many writers say, well, you know, I never really thought about that. So what are you working for? What are you working for? Why would you major in something where, you know, no, it's not a license to fish and hunt every day, all day. Some people think that. But some people work it. But he's much more than that. I talk about Rick a lot, but, you know, I look at a personification of land ethic in students and following passion. And you find those people and point the students in the direction of those people. We have wonderful people who advise about, you know, the classes to take, and we're trying to get better and better and better at that and more efficient. But I think part of that story is we need to let people know about the commas in the puddle that made us pause. And if we can translate that to people, then I think we stand a better chance of holding on. We don't do the great job of that. And I'm going to say this, and I don't want us to take it the wrong way, but we can't out-science. You've heard of outsourcing, right? Don't out-science your heart. Happens. And I'll give it away. I will be prepared for this, because at the end of every defense, I'll ask these people who are experts, 4 or 5 more years, work in a project. And they've gone through all of their analyses, all of this, and they've got it down. And then I say, okay, I want you to take a minute now to tweet that out, tweet out that dissertation, you know, a picture that inspired you, and people freeze. Because they've been so busy with their head down, taking the data, that they've never looked up. You know, and that's an important, so when I say don't outsource, don't out-science your heart, sometimes you have to drop back and remember the wonder that got you involved in this in the first place. And when you do that, it's sort of a reset. I mean, I do it. And it becomes a reset into a point you say, oh, okay. Yeah, every problem in the world is not solved, but this is why I do this work. And that, I think, can take us to a different place. Kobe, you had a question?
Yeah, I did. First off,
It's kind of scary.
yeah, I'll probably Dr. Lanham, dad, whichever. But really good presentation. Talk about this idea of thinking about thought, or thinking about how you think about things. What was exactly that moment for you, or how would you challenge people to kind of think about their own thought process when it comes to nature?
Thank you. You know, it's one of the things that we've lost in higher education, and it's sort of been, honestly, it's been lost in the curriculum. I actually have a BA. Y'all know what that is? I have a BA in zoology. But part of that process of thinking about your thoughts is really being introspective and saying, well, you know, step back for a minute. And sometimes before stuff comes out of your mouth, before you hit the send button, say, what, do I really need to say that? You know, have you ever been talking to somebody and say, wait, did they really say that? So it's an introspective process, and it's a practice. It's sort of this daily practice. So from a nature standpoint, Kobe, I point to how we see nature. You know, and it was floating around for a while. There was this sort of, it wasn't a meme, it was this picture. And on one side, it was this great oak. And on one side was a swing, you know, that somebody would enjoy and recreate in. And on the other side was a rope, and somebody was lynched from it in the same tree. Same tree, different perspective, right? So not only am I looking at that tree thinking about, you know, the present fun that someone may have in it and say, oh yeah, you know, this tree, it's a great tree for this. But there are people who may have in their memory, right, from grandparents, from the ancestors, may have in their memory that this was a terror tree. right, William? And so trees are witness to many things. And so it's a matter of perspective. It's a matter of slowing down again sometimes. And again, that takes practice because we're in a sort of instant response world. And you don't have to respond instantaneously to what people send you. You know, sometimes thinking about it for a minute, or thinking about how people see, you know, I say this about, man, I was thinking about the fishing tournament, it was the Bassmaster Classic, right? And I grew up, now my daddy would catch bass on occasion because he was the only one who had a rod and reel. And that rod and reel was like some kind of magic stick. All we had were cane poles. That's all we had with bobbers on them, you know? And now that's some kind of fancy fishing if you do that. But for me, you know, I was thinking about all these fish people were catching, holding them up, you know, and they're doing all this catch and release stuff. But I tell people I grew up and catch and release was in a pan of grease. That was it. We didn't throw fish back. And guess what that's called? Subsistence. That's called subsistence. So, you know, creek chubs, Todd, my mother loved, she called them hornheads. She loved them. You know, my daddy didn't like them because they were bony. You know, jackfish, redfin pickerel, bony. It didn't matter. It all went, you know, they went home, got scaled, rolled in cornmeal and dropped. Step up from lard. But that, thinking about that. So people ask the question frequently, well, how do you get more Black and brown people involved in it? Well, we're involved in nature. We're out there, but maybe not in the way that you have prescribed we be out there. So if you look with just you open your eyes a little wider, you'll see people out there. Now, there are issues with it. I remember being in a barber shop years and years and years ago when I had hair to cut. And this old Black man was talking about these huge fish that he would get, you know, fish stories. And me in my science mind, right? I'm sitting listening to this old man, you know, respectfully, I thought, and then I start spouting fish advisories. And they looked at me, I almost lost my place to get my hair cut. And I had waited a long time for that tape up. But I was like, they like, what, throw it back? I said, well, you know, with the PCBs at Lake Hartwell and the data has shown. And they laughed me almost out of that place. Now, not that I didn't need to deliver that message, but I needed to think about how I delivered that message. I needed to think about how I delivered that message to those people. So that's what I'm talking about. Those kinds of experiences, you know, neither you nor your sister or your mother are birders, right? But you each have your own ethic. And people ask me all the time, well, don't they go birding with you? No. But to see an ethic evolve, as Leopold said, as a part of a process, you know, that allows me to think. So students teach me in that way because I'm not trying to make mini-me's. You know, graduate student I had years ago, Dr. Keenan Adams, I remember, man, we were like this for a while, you know, because I was like, nah, dude, you need to know all 120 of these birds on these creek bottoms because blah, 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 blah. And that wasn't him. So we kept thinking, and then I'm like, wait a minute. Instead of knowing 100 birds in mediocrity, what if we really narrow down the suite of birds he needs to know to 20 or 30? But all the while, my ego has been telling me, oh, this is your first Black PhD student. Make him like you. Oh, what is that? So I had to, but he helped me think about that. He helped me rethink that. And so that's the cool part about this process, that is sometimes that you can sort of push back and think about how you think. But we often think we don't have time to think about that. But it's that voice that helps you, I think, be a thinker, right? And being a thinker doesn't mean you always have the right answer. And that's the other thing. You know, answers are like widgets, and we keep trying to make them. Response is more like a sort of a calculus. All right, there's some room on the curve, these curves that are moving and sort of interacting. So, you know, loosen up on yourselves a bit. That's not telling you to be lazy and not to study, but think about why you're in the major that you're in. You know, don't suffer by somebody else's demands on you. If you need to be in something that edifies you, get in that thing. You know, find that thing that makes you run, because, you know, you're making decisions about the rest of your life now. So thinking about thought is it's why we're here. Thank you.
Listen, I want to say that last comment he made in the home place, great story about when he was here at Clemson and decided engineering isn't for me. And it was a tough decision in his life. But you as students, if you're searching, great story. I want to say the home place is a phenomenal book. I think it's better to listen to Drew read it on Audible than when I read the book. So that's what I say. If you want, and the great thing about Audible is students listen to it. It is phenomenal. Faculty, if y'all haven't listened, staff, incredible book. Especially, I'm not being favoritism, but if you grew up in part of South Carolina, and especially down West London, I had tears multiple times reading what the content was called podcast, why I do what I do. And so, Drew, cannot thank you enough when they selected. And two people I recognize, this is Dr. Bill McCoy, who is the director of the Rutland Institute, and Rachel Dow, who is the glue that holds all of us together. And I'm in this role because I serve on the faculty committee that advises the Rutland Institute. And so let's show appreciation to two of them, because they're why we got to have Drew here.
Can I thank a couple of people? I wanted my faculty peers thank y'all for coming. I really appreciate your support. All of you came. Kate Van Cantford, my assistant, thank you for coming from Aiken through Athens to help me. Colby, thank you. Will, Carson, and Kirby. Thank you all for all that you do, and go Tigers.
And Drew, y'all, for 2 years, I've been waiting to get this, because Drew received the Roland Alston Excellence in Communication Award during COVID. So we weren't able to get it him during COVID, and we've been back and forth in different ways. And so Drew has been using agriculture and natural resources to inspire and share the Clemson mission all around the globe. And so that's why I was so excited, because I've seen him speak at a couple other places, but I've never seen him speak to the college. So thank you for saying yes. And let's show our appreciation for the Roland Alston Award winner from 2020.